December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns under a morning sun that seems almost indifferent to the chaos unfolding below. Japanese torpedo bombers circle like predators over the shattered remains of the American Pacific Fleet. Explosions ripple across Battleship Row. The Arizona sinks in minutes, taking over 1,000 sailors with her. Oil-slicked water catches fire, creating walls of flame that consume everything in their path. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands thousands of miles away in Tokyo, receiving reports of the attack's devastating success. 18 ships damaged or destroyed, over 300 aircraft obliterated, more than 2,000 American servicemen dead. By any military standard, it is a triumph, yet Yamamoto's face remains grave, his eyes distant. His staff officers celebrate around him, convinced they have delivered a knockout blow to America's naval power in the Pacific. But Yamamoto knows something they do not. He knows that this brilliant tactical victory may be the spark that ignites Japan's ultimate destruction. This is the story of how Japan's most brilliant military minds came to understand a terrible truth. They had already lost a war that had barely begun. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more historical content like this. Admiral Yamamoto sits in his office at the Naval General Staff headquarters in Tokyo 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Rain drums against the windows, washing down the glass in sheets. The room smells of tobacco and strong green tea. Maps cover every wall, showing the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean from Japan's home islands to the distant shores of California. Yamamoto lights another cigarette, his third in the past hour. He is 57 years old, compact and precise in his movements, with eyes that have seen more of the world than most Japanese officers of his generation. He studied at Harvard University in the 1920s. He served as a naval attaché in Washington. He walked the streets of American cities, visited their factories, watched their assembly lines produce automobiles at a pace that seemed almost impossible. He knows what his colleagues refuse to acknowledge. America's industrial capacity dwarfs Japan's by a factor of 10 to 1, perhaps 20 to 1 in some critical areas like steel production and oil refining. His deputy, Captain Yasuji Watanabe, enters carrying more reports from Pearl Harbor. The young officer's face glows with pride. Watanabe believes they have crippled America for years, bought Japan the time it needs to consolidate its holdings in China, Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies. He believes the Americans, soft from decades of prosperity, will negotiate a settlement rather than fight a long war across the Pacific. Yamamoto stubs out his cigarette and looks at Watanabe with an expression the younger man cannot quite read. "You think we have won something important," Yamamoto says. "It is not a question." Watanabe nods enthusiastically, spreading reconnaissance photos across the desk. Battleships capsized, destroyers blown apart, hangars reduced to twisted metal and ash. Yamamoto studies the images without speaking. Finally, he points to one detail that everyone else has missed. "The aircraft carriers," he says quietly. "Where are the American carriers?" Watanabe fumbles through the reports. The Enterprise was supposed to be at Pearl Harbor, but had been delayed by storms. The Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. The Saratoga was in San Diego. All 3 carriers survived the attack unscathed. Yamamoto taps the photos. "We have sunk obsolete battleships," he tells Watanabe. "We have killed brave men and destroyed aging ships, but we have not eliminated America's carrier force. And carriers are the future of naval warfare. This was a tactical victory that accomplishes nothing strategically. Worse, we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve." The words hang in the air like smoke. Watanabe wants to argue, but cannot find the words. He has never been to America. He has never seen Detroit's automobile plants or Pittsburgh's steel mills. He has been taught that Japanese spirit, Japanese discipline, Japanese willingness to sacrifice will overcome any material disadvantage. Yamamoto knows better. He has done the mathematics. He has calculated how long Japan can sustain a war against American industrial might. The answer terrifies him. "We can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year," Yamamoto says, turning back to his maps. "After that, I have no confidence in our prospects. None whatsoever." 6 months later, in June 1942, Yamamoto's predictions begin to materialize with brutal clarity. The Battle of Midway unfolds over 4 days of confusion, miscalculation, and catastrophic losses for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yamamoto commands the operation from the battleship Yamato, positioned hundreds of miles behind the carrier strike force. He has devised an elaborate plan to lure America's remaining carriers into a trap where superior Japanese forces can destroy them. But the plan relies on assumptions that prove fatally flawed. American codebreakers have penetrated Japan's naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz knows Yamamoto's objectives, his timing, his force composition. The Americans are waiting. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese carrier aircraft strike Midway Island, encountering fierce resistance. While they rearm and refuel for a second strike, American dive bombers appear overhead. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers burst into flames. The Akagi, Yamamoto's former flagship. The Kaga, a converted battleship that has served since the 1920s. The Soryu, one of Japan's most modern carriers. A fourth carrier, the Hiryu, launches a counterattack that damages the American carrier Yorktown before it too catches fire and sinks. Japan loses 4 fleet carriers, all the frontline carriers that struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. America loses 1. More critically, Japan loses over 300 trained pilots and aircrew, men who took years to train and cannot be quickly replaced. Yamamoto receives the reports aboard the Yamato as night falls. His staff officers stand silent, waiting for orders. The admiral who had warned against this war now must face the consequences of its first major defeat. He considers pushing forward with his battleships, attempting to draw the Americans into a night surface action where Japan's superior night-fighting skills might salvage something from the disaster. But he knows this is emotional thinking, not strategic thinking. His battleships have no way to locate the American carriers in the darkness. By the time dawn breaks, American aircraft will find his exposed surface ships and destroy them. He orders a withdrawal. Later in his cabin, Yamamoto sits alone, smoking in the darkness. Captain Watanabe, who survived the sinking of the Akagi, has been picked up by a destroyer and brought to the flagship. He appears before Yamamoto, his uniform still smelling of smoke and fuel oil. The young officer is devastated, barely able to speak. Yamamoto pours him sake, makes him drink, and waits until Watanabe can report coherently. The story that emerges is one of cascading failures and impossible odds. The American attack caught Japan's carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with aircraft being rearmed on the hangar decks, with fuel lines open, with bombs and torpedoes stacked and ready. A few bombs in the right place created infernos that consumed ships designed to resist battle damage. But ships cannot resist fire. Fire spreads, fire consumes, fire kills. Yamamoto listens without interruption. When Watanabe finishes, the admiral speaks softly. "This is the beginning of the end," he says. "We cannot replace those ships. We cannot replace those pilots. America can replace everything they lost at Midway within months. They are building carriers faster than we can conceive. Their shipyards work around the clock. Their factories produce aircraft by the thousands. Their training schools graduate new pilots every week. We train men slowly, carefully, making each one exceptional. They train them adequately and rely on overwhelming numbers. In a long war, their method wins. Watanabe wants to protest, but cannot. The mathematics are undeniable. He has seen the intelligence reports on American production. He knows that America launched the carrier Essex in July 1942, just weeks after Midway. More carriers are under construction, light carriers, escort carriers, converted merchant ships fitted with flight decks. America is building a fleet that will blanket the Pacific. Japan cannot match this production. Japan does not have the steel, the oil, the industrial capacity or the trained workforce. The realization settles over Watanabe like a heavy blanket. Everything he was taught about Japanese superiority was a comforting lie. In Tokyo, other admirals begin reaching similar conclusions through different paths. Admiral Minechi Koga replaces Yamamoto as commander of the combined fleet in April 1943 after Yamamoto's aircraft is shot down over Bougainville. Koga inherits a deteriorating strategic situation. American forces have landed on Guadalcanal, fighting a brutal 6-month campaign that ends with Japan's evacuation of the island. The naval battles around Guadalcanal cost Japan 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers and 6 submarines. America loses 2 carriers, 8 cruisers and 14 destroyers. But America replaces these losses within months. Japan struggles to replace anything. Koga moves his headquarters to Truk, a massive lagoon in the Caroline Islands that serves as Japan's main naval base in the Central Pacific. He arrives to find a fleet that exists more on paper than in reality. Many ships are in port for repairs. Fuel shortages limit training exercises. Veteran pilots have been ground down through attrition, replaced by inexperienced flyers who have barely 100 hours of flight time. In the first years of the war, Japanese naval aviators trained for 2 years before seeing combat. Now they train for 6 months or less. They cannot match the skills of American pilots who benefit from better training, better aircraft, and better tactics refined through constant combat. Koga meets with his logistics officers and demands honest assessments. Captain Yoshitake Miwa, the fleet's logistics coordinator, spreads spreadsheets across the conference table. The numbers tell a story of inevitable decline. Japan's oil reserves are depleting faster than anticipated. Tankers bringing crude from the Dutch East Indies face growing attacks from American submarines. The submarine campaign, initially dismissed as ineffective, has become devastatingly successful. American submarines operate with impunity throughout Japanese-controlled waters, sinking merchant ships faster than Japan can replace them. Each tanker lost means less fuel for training, less fuel for operations, less fuel for the fleet. Miwa shows Koga projections that extend 6 months, 12 months, 18 months into the future. In every scenario, Japan's fuel situation becomes critical. We can fight 1 more major engagement, Miwa says, perhaps 2 if we husband our resources carefully. But after that, the fleet will be immobilized. We will have ships with no fuel to operate them. We will have aircraft that cannot fly. We will be reduced to defensive operations near our home islands, waiting for the Americans to come to us. Koga studies the charts in silence. He knows that defensive operations favor the attacker. America can choose when and where to strike, concentrating overwhelming force against isolated Japanese garrisons. Japan must spread its forces across thousands of miles of ocean, trying to defend everything and therefore defending nothing adequately. The conversation turns to doctrine and strategy. Koga and his staff review Japan's pre-war planning, which assumed a short, decisive conflict. Japanese strategists believed they could seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter, and force America to negotiate a settlement. The plan depended on America accepting the new status quo rather than fighting a long war of attrition. But America has shown no interest in negotiation. President Roosevelt has demanded unconditional surrender. The American public, outraged by Pearl Harbor, supports total war against Japan. Opinion polls show overwhelming majorities favor fighting until Japan is completely defeated, regardless of cost. This changes everything. Japan cannot win a war of attrition. Japan cannot match American production. Japan cannot replace losses at anything approaching American rates. Koga asks his intelligence officers about American capabilities. Commander Nakajima, who analyzes American industrial production, provides sobering details. In 1943 alone, America will launch over 20 fleet and light carriers. America will produce over 40,000 combat aircraft. America will manufacture over 20,000 tanks. American shipyards are building Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels, at a rate of 3 per day. America's factories operate 3 shifts around the clock, staffed by millions of workers, including women who have entered the workforce to replace men serving in the military. This level of mobilization exceeds anything Japan can achieve. "We are not fighting a nation," Nakajima says. "We are fighting an entire industrial civilization that has devoted itself to our destruction." The silence in the room becomes oppressive. These are proud men, professional officers who have devoted their lives to naval service. They are being confronted with their own irrelevance. All their training, all their expertise, all their carefully studied tactics matter less than American factories stamping out aircraft carriers like automobiles on an assembly line. It is a humiliating realization. It is also an undeniable one. Commander Nakajima spreads additional intelligence reports across the table. These documents detail American shipyard operations in ways that seem almost unbelievable to Japanese officers. The Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California employs over 40,000 workers operating in 3 8-hour shifts. They work under floodlights when darkness falls, maintaining constant production. The Brooklyn Navy Yard employs 70,000 workers, building everything from battleships to landing craft. Women comprise nearly 30% of the workforce, trained in welding, riveting, and assembly work that was exclusively male just 2 years earlier. These are not isolated facilities, but representative of dozens of major shipyards scattered across America's coasts and rivers. Nakajima shows photographs obtained through neutral channels, long assembly lines where Liberty ship sections are prefabricated, then moved to slipways for final assembly. Overhead, cranes moving massive steel plates into position, armies of workers swarming over partially completed hulls. The process resembles factory manufacturing more than traditional shipbuilding. America has industrialized warfare in ways that Japan, despite its own industrial sophistication, cannot match. Japan's shipyards remain organized around traditional methods. Skilled craftsmen work on individual ships, building them carefully, precisely, one at a time. It produces superior quality but catastrophic quantity. One photograph particularly disturbs Koga's staff. It shows the launch ceremony for the Essex-class carrier Bunker Hill in December 1942. The ship was laid down in September 1941, just 3 months before Pearl Harbor. From keel laying to launch took 15 months. Essex herself, the class's lead ship, took even less time. American yards are standardizing carrier designs, creating assembly line methods that produce fleet carriers faster than Japan can build destroyers. The Essex-class program calls for building 32 carriers. 32. Japan began the war with 6 large fleet carriers and never successfully completed another during the war's duration. Captain Miwa, the logistics officer, provides additional context that deepens the gloom. American oil production in 1943 will exceed 3 billion barrels. Japan's total oil reserves, including captured Dutch East Indies fields, amount to perhaps 50 million barrels annually. America produces 60 times more oil than Japan can access. This disparity manifests in countless ways. American ships can steam at full speed without concern for fuel consumption. American aircraft can train extensively, burning fuel freely to develop pilot skills. American tanks can maneuver aggressively, knowing refueling is always available. Japan must husband every gallon. Training flights are cut back. Ships steam at economical speeds. Operations are cancelled or postponed due to fuel shortages. The fuel situation creates a death spiral. Reduced training means less skilled pilots. Less skilled pilots suffer higher casualties in combat. Higher casualties mean more replacement pilots must be trained. But reduced fuel means training must be cut back further. Each generation of pilots becomes progressively less capable than their predecessors. Japanese naval aviation begins the war with pilots who have logged over 600 hours of flight time before seeing combat. By mid-1943, pilots enter combat with barely 100 hours. By 1944, some have less than 50 hours. They cannot execute basic carrier landings consistently. They cannot navigate effectively. They cannot employ tactics requiring precise coordination. They are, in effect, sacrificial victims rather than combat aviators. American pilots, by contrast, benefit from systematic training programs that improve throughout the war. New pilots receive over 300 hours of training, including extensive gunnery practice and tactical exercises. They learn from combat veterans rotated home to serve as instructors. They practice against mock adversaries using captured Japanese aircraft, learning enemy strengths and weaknesses. By the war's middle years, American pilots enjoy overwhelming qualitative superiority in addition to massive numerical advantage. A typical Japanese pilot in 1944 faces American opponents who are better trained, flying superior aircraft supported by better tactics, backed by unlimited logistics. The outcome of such encounters becomes grimly predictable. Koga makes a decision that night. He will not waste his fleet in hopeless offensives. He will conserve his strength, husband his resources, and wait for an opportunity where Japanese advantages in night fighting and close-range combat might compensate for American material superiority. This defensive posture represents an acknowledgement of reality. Japan cannot win through offensive action. Japan can only hope to make conquest so costly that America might negotiate a compromise peace. But Koga knows this hope is probably futile. America has already paid enormous costs in blood and treasure. American casualties in the Pacific number in the tens of thousands. Yet America continues fighting, continues building, continues advancing. There is no sign of weakening resolve. The defensive strategy crystallizes over several weeks of planning sessions. Koga meets daily with his staff, reviewing intelligence reports, assessing American movements, trying to predict where the next blow will fall. The Americans are advancing on multiple axes. In the South Pacific, they are fighting their way up the Solomon Islands chain. In the Central Pacific, they are preparing operations against the Gilbert Islands. In the North Pacific, they have secured the Aleutians. Japan must defend everywhere, while possessing insufficient forces to defend anywhere adequately. This is the strategic nightmare that Yamamoto warned about before the war began. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya serves on Koga's staff as an air operations officer. He is 32 years old, a veteran pilot who flew fighters in China before the war. He participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, flying cover for the torpedo bombers. He fought at Coral Sea and Midway, surviving both battles through a combination of skill and extraordinary luck. Now, grounded by staff assignment, he watches younger pilots die in battles that accomplish nothing strategic. The waste torments him. These young men, barely trained, fly obsolete aircraft against overwhelming opposition. They fight bravely. They die quickly. Their sacrifice buys nothing except a few more days before the next defeat. Okumiya drafts a memo that he knows will anger his superiors, but which he feels compelled to write. The memo argues that Japan's entire strategic approach is fundamentally flawed. Trying to defend a vast perimeter with limited forces guarantees defeat in detail. American forces can concentrate overwhelming strength against isolated Japanese garrisons, destroying them systematically. Japan rushes reinforcements to threatened areas, but these reinforcements arrive piecemeal, consumed by American attacks before they can be effectively employed. The proper strategy, Okumiya argues, would be to contract the defensive perimeter, abandoning outlying positions, concentrating forces closer to Japan where supply lines are shorter and mutual support is possible. The memo circulates among staff officers before reaching Koga. Most dismiss it as defeatist. Abandoning territory without fighting contradicts everything Japanese military doctrine teaches, but Koga reads it carefully, recognizing the logic even as he understands the political impossibility of implementing such a strategy. The government will not authorize voluntary withdrawal from conquered territories. The army will not agree to abandon positions purchased with Japanese blood. The emperor himself has proclaimed that captured territories must be held at all costs. Koga can no more implement Okumiya's strategy than he can negotiate peace directly with Roosevelt. Still, the memo sparks discussions that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Officers begin openly questioning whether current strategy serves any purpose beyond delaying inevitable defeat. Captain Kiyoshi Hasegawa, a logistics officer, calculates that at current attrition rates, Japan's trained pilot cadre will be effectively exhausted within 18 months. After that, naval aviation will cease to exist as a meaningful combat force. Someone asks what happens then. Hasegawa's answer is blunt. Then Japan loses the war. The question becomes not whether Japan will lose, but how much destruction Japan will suffer before admitting defeat. These conversations occur in quiet corners, late at night, away from formal command structures. Openly discussing defeat remains dangerous even among professionals who recognize reality. Yet the conversations continue because these men need to articulate what they privately understand. They need to share the burden of knowledge that they cannot act upon. They need to prepare psychologically for an outcome they cannot prevent. It is a strange form of collective therapy, acknowledging disaster while maintaining public commitment to fighting on. Winter of 1943 brings new American offensives. Marines land at Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, fighting a brutal 76-hour battle that kills nearly 6,000 Japanese defenders. American casualties are also severe, over 3,000 killed or wounded. But America can replace these losses. Japan cannot. More critically, Tarawa demonstrates American ability to conduct large-scale amphibious assaults against fortified positions. Japanese strategists had hoped that making islands into fortresses would render them too costly for Americans to capture. Tarawa proves this assumption wrong. Americans will pay the price. They will absorb casualties that would cripple Japanese forces, and they will continue advancing. Koga watches these developments with growing despair. He has tried to conserve his fleet, tried to wait for favorable conditions, tried to find some opportunity where Japanese advantages might produce victory. But favorable conditions never materialize. American submarines sink his tankers. American aircraft attack his bases. American forces advance relentlessly, grinding down Japanese resistance through sheer material superiority. In February 1944, when American carriers strike Truk, Koga understands that nowhere is safe. The great fortress he believed impregnable falls in a day. His fleet must retreat again, pulling back closer to Japan, abandoning advanced positions that cannot be defended. The night after the Truk attack, Koga sits in his quarters writing a letter to his wife. He has not seen her in 18 months. She lives in Tokyo with their 3 children, enduring shortages, rationing, and constant fear of air raids. Koga writes carefully, aware that his letter will be censored, unable to express fully what he feels. He tells her about small things, the weather, the food, his health. He asks about their children, their schooling, their activities. He does not mention the war directly. But between the lines, in the careful phrasing, in the tone of resignation, he conveys what he cannot say explicitly. He does not expect to see her again. He does not expect to survive the war. He wants her to know that he loves her, that he has tried his best, that he has failed. In February 1944, American carriers strike Truk in a devastating raid that catches Koga by surprise. He has moved his headquarters, but many ships remain in the lagoon. American aircraft attack in waves, sinking 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 3 auxiliaries, and 32 merchant ships. They destroy over 200 aircraft. The raid demonstrates American carrier aviation's growing sophistication, coordinated strikes, fighter sweeps that clear the skies of defenders. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers working in concert. The Japanese base, once considered impregnable, proves vulnerable to carrier-based air power. Koga realizes that nowhere in Japan's defensive perimeter is safe. American carriers can strike anywhere, anytime, with devastating effect. After Truk, Koga moves his headquarters again, this time to the Philippines. He dies in March 1944, when his aircraft disappears in a storm. Admiral Somu Toyoda replaces him, becoming the last wartime commander of the combined fleet. Toyoda is 59 years old, a veteran of Japan's war against Russia in 1905. He remembers Japan's great victory at Tsushima, when Admiral Togo's fleet annihilated a Russian squadron that had sailed halfway around the world. Toyoda believes that spirit and tactical excellence can still produce victory. He is wrong, but he does not understand this yet. Toyoda takes command during Japan's darkest hour, though he does not initially grasp the full extent of the crisis. His first briefings reveal a fleet that exists largely on paper. Ships are scattered across thousands of miles. Crews are undertrained. Fuel reserves are critically low. Aircraft production cannot keep pace with losses. The industrial base is crumbling under American submarine attacks that have severed supply lines from the resource-rich territories Japan conquered in 1942. Yet Toyoda retains faith in Japanese fighting spirit. He believes that determination and sacrifice can overcome material disadvantages. This belief sustained Japan through earlier conflicts. Against Russia in 1905, Japanese forces defeated a numerically superior enemy through superior tactics and morale. Against China, Japanese armies conquered vast territories despite being outnumbered. Toyoda assumes the same pattern will hold against America. It will not. His chief of staff, Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, tries to provide realistic assessments. Kusaka is a cautious, methodical officer who understands logistics and operational limitations. He shows Toyoda detailed analyses of fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and aircraft replacement rates. The numbers paint a picture of accelerating collapse. Japan is consuming military resources faster than they can be replaced. This creates a window of perhaps 6 months, during which Japan can mount one last major operation before the fleet becomes effectively inoperable. After that, Japan will be reduced to purely defensive operations, waiting in port for American forces to arrive. Toyoda listens, but hears only what confirms his pre-existing beliefs. He focuses on reports of Japanese soldiers fighting to the death on Pacific Islands. He reads accounts of kamikaze pilots volunteering for suicide missions. He interprets these as signs of unbreakable Japanese will that will eventually wear down American resolve. What he does not understand, what Kusaka cannot make him understand, is that American resolve is not weakening. If anything, Japanese resistance stiffens American determination to completely destroy Japan's military capacity. Every island that must be taken by frontal assault convinces Americans that Japan will never surrender voluntarily. This perception drives American strategy toward total destruction rather than negotiated settlement. The disconnect between Toyoda's perceptions and Kusaka's reality creates tension within the naval staff. Younger officers, particularly those who have studied in America or who have access to intelligence about American production, align with Kusaka's pessimism. Older officers, steeped in traditions of Bushido and memories of past victories, align with Toyoda's optimism. The split is not absolute. Many officers hold contradictory views, believing simultaneously in inevitable defeat and necessary resistance. But the split is real enough to paralyze effective strategic planning. Some officers advocate conserving forces for homeland defense. Others argue for offensive operations that might inflict sufficient casualties to bring Americans to the negotiating table. The result is compromise plans that satisfy no one and accomplish nothing. Operation A-Go emerges from these fractured discussions. The plan calls for drawing American carriers into a decisive battle where land-based aircraft operating from Guam and Saipan will supplement Japan's carrier air groups. Together, these forces might achieve local air superiority long enough to destroy American carriers. It is an ambitious plan requiring precise coordination, perfect timing, and multiple favorable assumptions. It assumes Japanese pilots can match American pilots qualitatively despite inferior training. It assumes land-based aircraft can operate effectively despite American strikes against their airfields. It assumes American commanders will cooperate by sailing into the planned killing zone. Every assumption is questionable. Some are demonstrably false, but Toyoda approves the plan because alternatives appear worse. Doing nothing guarantees slow strangulation. Attempting offensive action offers at least theoretical hope of changing the strategic situation. Toyoda develops Operation A-Go, a plan to draw the American fleet into a decisive battle in the Philippine Sea. He assembles Japan's remaining carrier strength, 9 carriers with 430 aircraft. American intelligence tracks every movement. Admiral Raymond Spruance commands the American Fifth Fleet, 15 carriers with 900 aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolds on June 19th and 20th, 1944. It becomes known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft attack in poorly coordinated waves. American fighter pilots, flying superior Hellcat fighters, intercept them. Japanese losses are catastrophic. Over 300 aircraft shot down. 2 carriers sunk by American submarines, another carrier damaged and later sunk by aircraft. American losses, 30 aircraft. The battle destroys Japan's carrier aviation as an effective force. The surviving carriers return to Japan, unable to operate without aircraft or trained pilots to fly them. Toyoda receives the reports at his headquarters in Japan. The extent of the disaster takes days to fully understand. Initial reports claim moderate losses. But as survivors return and detailed assessments arrive, the truth emerges. Japan's carrier force no longer exists as a fighting entity. The carriers themselves still float, but they have no aircraft, no pilots, no ability to project power. They are expensive, useless hulls, consuming precious fuel oil. Toyoda meets with his staff to assess options. There are no good options. American forces are advancing across the Pacific. They have taken the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands. Now they are invading the Marianas, placing B-29 bombers within range of Japan's home islands. The defensive perimeter that Japan established in 1942 is collapsing. Lieutenant Commander Okumiya, who survived the carrier battles, returns to headquarters to provide first-hand testimony. He appears before Toyoda's staff, still wearing a borrowed uniform, his own having been lost when his carrier was abandoned. Okumiya describes the battle in clinical detail, suppressing emotions that threaten to overwhelm him. He speaks of aircraft launching in uncoordinated waves, lacking the fuel to loiter while forming up properly. He describes intercepting American fighters that seemed to be everywhere at once, superior in numbers, altitude, position, and pilot skill. He tells of watching inexperienced Japanese pilots make elementary mistakes, breaking formation, fixating on single targets, failing to maintain situational awareness. American pilots exploited these mistakes ruthlessly. Japanese aircraft fell from the sky in numbers that seemed impossible. What haunts Okumiya most is not the enemy's skill, but his own side's incompetence. These young pilots, sent into battle with inadequate training, never had a chance. They were sacrificed not through tactical necessity, but through systemic failure to acknowledge reality. Japan could not train pilots properly because fuel shortages limited flight hours. Japan could not replace lost pilots because training took time that strategic circumstances did not allow. Japan could not withdraw from combat to rebuild its air groups because political and military leadership refused to acknowledge the need for such measures. So pilots were rushed through abbreviated training and thrown into combat, where they died, accomplishing nothing except to slightly delay American advances. Toyoda listens to Okumiya's report without visible emotion. When the lieutenant commander finishes, Toyoda asks a single question. Could anything we did differently have changed the outcome? Okumiya considers this carefully. He wants to say yes, wants to believe that better tactics or different dispositions might have altered the battle's course. But he cannot lie to himself or his commander. No, sir, he says quietly. We were outnumbered 3-1. Our pilots were outmatched qualitatively and quantitatively. Our aircraft were inferior. Our coordination was poor. We could not have won that battle no matter what we did. The material disparity was too great. The room falls silent. Toyoda nods slowly, as if Okumiya's assessment confirms something he already suspected, but could not articulate. Then our carrier force is finished, Toyoda says. It is not a question. Okumiya confirms it. Japan has carriers but cannot operate them effectively. The ships themselves are intact, but operationally useless without aircraft and trained pilots to fly them. Reconstituting Japan's carrier air groups would require at least a year, probably longer. By then, the war will be over. Japan no longer has a year. Japan probably does not have 6 months. Captain Toshikazu Omai, a staff officer who has served under Yamamoto Koga and now Toyoda, speaks with brutal honesty during one planning session. We have lost, he says simply. We lost at Midway. We lost at Guadalcanal. We lost in the Marianas. We keep fighting because surrender is unthinkable, but continuing this war only increases the ultimate cost. Every day we fight, more cities burn, more soldiers die, more civilians suffer. The rational course is to seek peace now, before American bombers reduce our cities to ash. His words are close to treason. Suggesting surrender violates everything Japanese military culture stands for. But Omai is beyond caring about propriety. He has watched Japan's navy destroyed piece by piece. He has seen plans built on fantasy collapse against American reality. He cannot remain silent anymore. Toyoda does not reprimand Omai. Instead, he nods slowly. You are correct, the Admiral says, but we cannot control political decisions. The government believes that fighting on might produce a negotiated settlement. They believe that making invasion prohibitively costly will force America to compromise. Our duty is to follow orders and execute the missions assigned to us. It is a response that acknowledges reality while accepting impotence. These men, these admirals and captains, who commanded the world's most powerful navy just 3 years ago, now understand they are managing decline. They are presiding over destruction. They are sending men to die in battles that cannot be won for a cause that is already lost. The conversation continues for hours, ranging across strategic assessments, operational possibilities, and philosophical questions about duty and honor. Some officers argue that continuing resistance preserves Japan's honor even in defeat. Others contend that honor means nothing if the nation is destroyed. Some believe that inflicting heavy casualties on American forces might still produce a negotiated peace. Others point out that America has shown no interest in negotiation, that Roosevelt's demand for unconditional surrender remains unchanged despite growing American casualties. The debate is circular, returning always to the same insoluble problem. Japan cannot win, but cannot surrender. Therefore, Japan must fight on, piling up casualties and destruction until external circumstances force an end to hostilities. During a break in the meeting, Omai approaches Okumiya privately. The two men have become friends, despite differences in age and rank. Both are fundamentally honest officers who cannot deceive themselves about their situation. "How do you cope?" Omai asks. "How do you continue functioning when you know that everything we do is futile?" Okumiya has thought about this question extensively. His answer reflects hard-won wisdom. "I focus on the men under my command," he says. "I cannot change the war's outcome. I cannot alter strategic decisions, but I can try to ensure that when men die under my orders, they die for achievable tactical objectives rather than strategic fantasies. I can try to give their death some meaning even if the larger war is meaningless." Omai finds this answer simultaneously comforting and deeply sad. It represents a retreat from grand strategy into narrow professionalism. But what alternative exists? These men are cogs in a machine that cannot stop running until it destroys itself completely. They can perform their functions with integrity or without. They can try to minimize suffering or ignore it. They cannot change fundamental outcomes. So they choose to maintain professional standards, execute orders competently, and hope that history might recognize their impossible position. In October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy makes its last desperate gamble. American forces land on Leyte in the Philippines. Japan responds with Operation Shogo, a complex plan that divides the fleet into multiple forces attempting to converge on the American landing area. The plan requires precise timing, communication between widely separated forces, and air support that Japan no longer possesses. It fails catastrophically. American forces sink 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is the largest naval battle in history. It is also Japan's death sentence as a naval power. After Leyte, the combined fleet essentially ceases to exist. A few ships survive and return to Japan, but they cannot operate without fuel, without escorts, without air cover. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commands the first striking force during Leyte Gulf. His force of battleships and cruisers fights its way through the San Bernardino Strait, only to withdraw at the moment of apparent victory. Kurita later struggles to explain his decision. He had broken through American destroyer screens. He had damaged escort carriers. The landing area was within reach. But he faced constant air attacks. His ships were low on ammunition. Communication with other Japanese forces had collapsed. He could not tell if the operation as a whole was succeeding or failing. In that moment of confusion and exhaustion, Kurita decided that pressing the attack would only result in his forces' annihilation without accomplishing anything meaningful. He withdrew. His decision is heavily criticized in Japan. Some call it cowardice. But Kurita understood what his critics did not. The battle was already lost. Japan had already lost. Sacrificing his ships would not change the outcome. The complexity of Shogo doomed it from the beginning. The plan divided Japanese naval forces into 4 separate groups, approaching Leyte from different directions. Ozawa's carrier force, stripped of most aircraft, would serve as a decoy to draw American carriers north. Nishimura's force would penetrate Surigao Strait from the south. Shima's force would follow Nishimura. Kurita's powerful center force would thread through San Bernardino Strait and attack the landing beaches from the northeast. If everything worked perfectly, these forces would converge simultaneously, overwhelming American defenses through sheer confusion and multiple threats. But nothing worked perfectly. Nothing even worked adequately. Nishimura's force entered Surigao Strait on the night of October 24th, sailing into a trap. American battleships, many of them raised from the mud at Pearl Harbor and refurbished, waited at the strait's northern end. American destroyers launched torpedo attacks that sank 2 battleships and damaged cruisers. When Nishimura's surviving ships reached the waiting battleships, they encountered devastating gunfire at ranges where Japanese guns could barely respond. Nishimura died aboard his flagship Yamashiro as it capsized and sank. Shima's following force encountered burning wreckage, realized the attack had failed, and withdrew without accomplishing anything. The southern pincer collapsed completely. Ozawa's carrier force succeeded in its mission too well. American carriers pursued the decoy force northward, engaging in a running battle that sank all 4 Japanese carriers. But Ozawa's success in drawing away American carriers meant that Kurita's center force faced lighter opposition than anticipated. When Kurita emerged from San Bernardino Strait on the morning of October 25th, he found himself confronting escort carriers, small, lightly armed ships designed to provide air support for landing operations, not fight surface engagements. These jeep carriers should have been easy prey for Kurita's battleships and cruisers. Yet the battle that followed became chaotic and indecisive. American escort carriers fled south, launching every available aircraft. Destroyers and destroyer escorts charged Kurita's battleships in suicidal torpedo attacks that disrupted Japanese formations. Aircraft attacked relentlessly, despite lacking armor-piercing bombs capable of seriously damaging battleships. The Americans fought with desperate courage, throwing themselves at overwhelming force, buying time for the carriers to escape. Kurita's ships scored hits. They sank the carrier Gambia Bay, 3 destroyers and a destroyer escort. But they could not catch the fleeing carriers. Japanese gunnery proved less accurate than pre-war doctrine assumed. Coordination between ships broke down. Communications failed. Kurita's force became dispersed, chasing individual targets instead of maintaining cohesive formations. Standing on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, Kurita watched the battle degenerate into confused melee. Reports flooded in, contradicting each other. One cruiser reported sinking a fleet carrier. Another reported battleships approaching from the north. Aircraft reported massive American reinforcements converging on his position. None of these reports were accurate, but Kurita had no way to verify information. His radio communications were jammed or disrupted. His scout planes were too few to provide reliable reconnaissance. He commanded the most powerful surface force Japan could still assemble, but he was effectively blind, operating on fragmentary information and increasingly desperate assumptions. At 10:30 in the morning, Kurita made his decision. He ordered a withdrawal. His stated reasoning was that continuing the attack risked his force's destruction without clear evidence that the operation's other elements had succeeded. His critics would argue that he had broken through American defenses, that the landing area was vulnerable, that pressing on might have destroyed American transports and supply ships even if he lost his entire force. But Kurita understood something. His critics did not. Destroying transports would not change strategic outcomes. American industrial capacity would replace any lost ships within weeks. Meanwhile, his battleships represented Japan's last significant surface force. Losing them at Leyte would not bring victory, it would merely hasten Japan's final defeat. Kurita survives the war and lives long enough to reflect on his decisions. In later interviews, he expresses a quiet resignation about the war's outcome. "We knew we could not win," he says, "but we could not admit it. We could not stop fighting. Japanese culture does not permit surrender until every possibility is exhausted. So we fought on, knowing that each day brought only more destruction, more death, more suffering. The Americans understood this about us. They knew we would fight to the end. That is why they were so ruthless. They had to be. We left them no choice." His words reveal the psychological trap that ensnared Japan's military leadership. They understood intellectually that the war was lost. But understanding did not translate into action, because action required admitting defeat publicly, something Japanese culture made nearly impossible. So they continued fighting, continued sacrificing men and ships, continued managing collapse while maintaining public fiction that victory remained possible. This collective delusion extracted a terrible price from both sides, but especially from Japan itself. In the war's final months, what remains of Japan's navy sites immobilized in port, unable to operate for lack of fuel. American submarines and aircraft have destroyed Japan's merchant fleet. Oil cannot reach Japan from the conquered territories. Food cannot reach Japanese cities. Raw materials for war production stop flowing. American bombers, initially operating from bases in the Marianas, begin firebombing Japanese cities. Tokyo burns in March 1945, killing over 100,000 people in a single night. Other cities follow: Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama. The bombers face minimal opposition. Japan has no fuel for fighters. Japan has few experienced pilots left. Japan's air defenses have collapsed. The firebombing campaign represents strategic bombing taken to its logical extreme. American planners, frustrated by the limited effectiveness of precision bombing against German cities, adopt different tactics against Japan. Instead of attacking specific industrial targets, they attack cities themselves. Incendiary bombs create firestorms that consume entire neighborhoods. Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, burn with terrifying efficiency. A single B-29 raid can destroy 10 square miles of urban area, killing tens of thousands, rendering hundreds of thousands homeless. The human cost is staggering. The strategic impact is equally devastating. Japan's remaining industrial capacity, much of it dispersed into small workshops throughout cities, burns along with residential areas. Admiral Toyoda remains in command, but he commands a fleet that exists only on paper. His surviving ships are scattered among ports, hidden in bays, camouflaged against air attack. They cannot move. They cannot fight. They can only wait for the end. Toyoda meets with other surviving senior officers in June 1945. The military situation is hopeless. American forces have conquered Okinawa after brutal fighting that killed over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians. American forces are preparing for invasion of the home islands. Intelligence estimates predict that invasion will come in November 1945, with landings on Kyushu, followed by assaults on Honshu in 1946. The assembled officers discuss whether Japan can sustain resistance during an invasion. The army has mobilized civilian militia. They have stockpiled what weapons they can produce. They have prepared plans for national suicide, a final battle where every Japanese fights to the death defending their homeland. But these are fantasy plans disconnected from reality. Japan has no fuel, Japan has minimal ammunition, Japan has few intact military units capable of sustained combat. An invasion would be a massacre. Captain Miwa, the logistics officer who provided earlier assessments of Japan's deteriorating supply situation, delivers an update that removes any remaining illusions. Japan's food supplies will last perhaps 3 more months at current consumption rates. After that, mass starvation becomes inevitable. The submarine blockade has cut off all imports. Domestic agriculture cannot feed Japan's population, which has swollen with refugees from bombed cities crowding into rural areas. Industrial production has effectively ceased. Factories lack raw materials. Transportation networks are destroyed. Workers are starving or dead. Japan has become a nation dying by degrees, sustained only by institutional inertia and cultural inability to acknowledge defeat. Toyoda listens to these assessments with an expression of profound weariness. He is 60 years old and looks 80. The stress of commanding a losing war has aged him beyond his years. His hair has turned completely white. He has lost weight. He sleeps poorly when he sleeps at all. He knows that Japan must surrender. He knows that every additional day of fighting serves no purpose except to increase suffering. But he cannot say these things publicly. He cannot advocate surrender. He can only execute orders and wait for someone with political authority to make decisions that military officers cannot make. The discussion turns to potential terms of surrender. Some officers argue that Japan must demand conditions: preservation of the imperial system, no foreign occupation, no war crimes trials. Others contend that Japan is in no position to demand anything. America has demanded unconditional surrender. America has the military power to enforce that demand. Japan can accept American terms or face complete destruction. There is no third option. The debate becomes heated, with some officers arguing that death is preferable to surrender on American terms. These officers speak eloquently about honor, tradition, and the warrior spirit. They speak less about the practical consequences of their position. Millions of Japanese will die if the war continues. Cities will burn. The nation will be reduced to rubble. For what? To preserve honor, to avoid the shame of surrender. Lieutenant Commander Okumiya, who has survived 3 years of combat and now serves on Toyoda's staff, cannot contain himself any longer. He interrupts the debate with words that would have gotten him arrested a year earlier. "This talk of honor and death is self-indulgent luxury," he says angrily. "We failed. We started a war we could not win. We ignored warnings from officers who understood American capabilities. We sacrificed hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives pursuing impossible objectives. Now we have the arrogance to suggest that millions more should die so that we can avoid facing consequences of our failures. That is not honor. That is cowardice. Real honor would be accepting responsibility, accepting defeat, and working to rebuild what we have destroyed." The room falls into shocked silence. Officers stare at Okumiya, some with anger, some with approval, most with expressions of confused recognition. He has articulated what many feel but cannot say. The emperor system, the code of Bushido, the entire structure of Japanese military culture has failed catastrophically. Acknowledging this requires intellectual courage that few possess. It is easier to continue with comfortable fictions about honor and sacrifice than to confront the brutal reality that Japan's leadership destroyed the nation through arrogance, ignorance, and refusal to acknowledge limitations. Toyoda knows this. His colleagues know this. They have known it for years, but knowing and acting are different things. These men are products of their culture, shaped by institutions that do not permit the flexibility required to adapt to their situation. So they sit in meetings, debate meaningless questions, and wait for external events to resolve problems they cannot address themselves. It is simultaneously tragic and pathetic. Men who devoted their lives to naval service reduced to impotent observers of their nation's destruction. Toyoda knows this. His colleagues know this. But admitting it requires acknowledging that Japan should surrender immediately to avoid further suffering. Surrender remains unthinkable. The emperor has not spoken. The government has not decided, so the military prepares for battles it cannot win, for an invasion that will destroy what remains of Japanese civilization, for death on an unprecedented scale. Then, in August, American bombers drop atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union enters the war, attacking Japanese forces in Manchuria. The emperor speaks for the first time in Japanese history, broadcasting to the nation, announcing Japan's surrender. Admiral Toyoda hears the broadcast with his staff at naval headquarters. The emperor's voice is thin, distant, speaking in formal court Japanese that many ordinary citizens can barely understand. But the message is clear enough. The war is ending. Japan has lost. The officers stand in silence after the broadcast ends. Some cry. Others stand rigid, faces expressionless. Toyoda lights a cigarette, his hand steady. "It is finished," he says quietly. "We fought as well as we could. But we were overwhelmed by forces we could not match. America's industrial power was too great. Their resolve was too strong. We underestimated both." He pauses, drawing on his cigarette. "Admiral Yamamoto warned us. He told us we could not win a long war. He was correct. We should have listened." The words hang in the air, a final acknowledgement of what everyone present has known for years. They fought a war they knew they would lose because their culture, their institutions, and their political system provided no mechanism for preventing that war or ending it once begun. They are not victims. They participated willingly in planning and executing aggressive warfare, but they are also not simple villains. They are men caught in circumstances that exceeded their ability to control, forced to make impossible choices between bad options and worse ones, watching helplessly as their predictions of disaster came inexorably true. In the weeks after surrender, Allied forces occupy Japan. American officers meet with their Japanese counterparts, conducting interviews, reviewing records, trying to understand how the war developed. A young American naval intelligence officer, Lieutenant Robert Wilkinson, interviews Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who survived the war despite being Yamamoto's chief of staff and constant companion. Wilkinson asks when Ugaki first believed Japan would lose. Ugaki considers the question carefully. "From the beginning," he says finally. "Admiral Yamamoto explained it before Pearl Harbor. We could not match American production. We could not sustain a long war. Pearl Harbor was supposed to give us a negotiating position, a way to achieve a settlement before America could fully mobilize, but it had the opposite effect. It unified America. It gave Americans a reason to fight with total commitment. From that moment, our defeat was inevitable. We simply did not admit it." Wilkinson presses further. "Why continue fighting if defeat was inevitable?" Ugaki's answer is simple. "Because we could not surrender. Not until every option was exhausted. Not until the emperor commanded it. Japanese warriors do not yield. We fight until death or until ordered to stop. We fought for 3 years and 8 months knowing we would lose. We fought because that is what we were trained to do. That is what our culture demanded. We did not choose this outcome, but we accepted it." The interviews continue for months. A pattern emerges. Nearly every senior Japanese naval officer understood at some level that Japan could not win a long war against American industrial power. Most reached this conclusion early, many within the first year of fighting, but institutional culture, political pressure, and military tradition prevented them from acting on this knowledge. So they fought on, managing decline, executing operations they knew were doomed, sending men to die for a cause already lost. It was a collective madness, born from cultural imperatives that could not accommodate reality. The exact moment each admiral realized defeat was inevitable varied. For Yamamoto, it was before the war even began, when he calculated production figures and understood the mathematics. For Koga, it was after Midway, when Japan lost 4 carriers it could not replace. For Toyoda, it was after the Philippine Sea, when carrier aviation ceased to exist. For Kurita, it was during Leyte Gulf, when he recognized that pressing an attack would accomplish nothing except his own destruction. For Ugaki, it was the day Pearl Harbor was attacked, when he saw Americans rage and knew they would never negotiate. But the realization itself changed nothing. These men could not alter Japan's course. They could not convince politicians to seek peace. They could not overcome cultural imperatives that demanded fighting to the last. They could not acknowledge publicly what they understood privately, that Japan had already lost a war that would not end until Japan was comprehensively destroyed. So they fought on, day after day, month after month, year after year, managing an inevitable defeat while hoping futilely for a miracle that never came. The final accounting is devastating. The Imperial Japanese Navy began the war with 10 battleships, 6 large carriers, 4 light carriers, 18 heavy cruisers, 20 light cruisers, and over 100 destroyers. By war's end, all 10 battleships are sunk or heavily damaged. All carriers are destroyed. Most cruisers and destroyers are at the bottom of the Pacific. Japan trained approximately 80,000 naval aviators during the war. Over 60,000 died in combat. The survivors lack aircraft to fly, fuel to train with, or ships to operate from. American forces, by contrast, finish the war with a fleet that dwarfs anything previously imagined. Over 20 fleet carriers, nearly 100 escort carriers, 8 modern battleships, over 400 destroyers, over 200 submarines. The industrial mobilization that Yamamoto feared proved even more devastating than he predicted. America outproduced Japan by factors ranging from 5 to 1 in some categories to 20 to 1 in others. American shipyards built over 5,000 merchant ships during the war. Japan sank many of these, but could not sink them faster than America built replacements. Japan's merchant fleet, by contrast, was systematically destroyed. Of the merchant ships Japan possessed in December 1941, over 90% were sunk by war's end. This strangled Japan's economy, cutting off resources, starving the population, rendering military operations impossible. In retrospect, Japan's admirals were correct in their grim assessments. The war was lost before it began. America's industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, rendered Japanese resistance futile. But recognizing futility did not provide these men with options. They could not end the war. They could not force surrender. They could only execute their duties, follow their orders, and watch as their predictions of disaster came inexorably true. It was a tragedy of enormous proportions, born from miscalculation, cultural imperatives, and an inability to acknowledge reality until reality imposed itself with crushing finality. The story of Japan's admirals during World War II is ultimately a story about the limits of human wisdom. These were educated, intelligent men who understood strategy, logistics, and naval warfare. Many saw clearly that Japan could not win, but clear sight did not translate into effective action. Institutional inertia, cultural programming, and political constraints prevented rational decision-making. So these admirals presided over the destruction of everything they had spent their lives building. They watched their fleet sink ship by ship. They saw their air forces decimated. They witnessed their nation burn to ash, And they did these things while knowing, at some deep level, that it was all pointless, all futile, all predetermined by forces they could neither control nor resist. It is a sobering lesson about the nature of war, the limits of military professionalism, and the danger of cultural systems that cannot adapt to changing reality. Japan's admirals were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. They fought a war they knew they would lose because their culture left them no alternative. Understanding this does not excuse the suffering they caused or the aggression that started the conflict. But it does provide insight into how intelligent people can make catastrophic decisions, how clear-eyed assessment can coexist with continued disaster, and how military institutions can continue functioning even after their strategic situation has become hopeless. The moment Japanese admirals realized they had already lost the war came at different times for different men, but the realization itself changed nothing. The war ground on until external force, in the form of atomic weapons and Soviet invasion, finally provided Japanese leadership with sufficient justification to accept what their admirals had understood for years, that continuing the fight served no purpose except to increase the final butcher's bill. By then, millions were dead, entire cities lay in ruins, and Japan faced occupation and reconstruction under foreign control. The admirals who had warned of this outcome from the beginning could only watch as their darkest predictions came true, powerless to prevent a catastrophe they had seen approaching from the war's first day.